Welcome, folks. This is The Last Hike. Today I'm telling you about an unfortunate family of four who saved for a year for one big trip, thinking a brutal hike like this would be just as easy as Disneyland. This wasn't your usual trip, and none of them were unprepared in the way people assume. They had the permit, the gloves, and a plan written down on paper. But what happened to them on the last 400 feet of bare rock is a horrifying story you will never forget. It was the 2nd of August, 2022, in Yosemite National Park, high on Half Dome, where a family of four from Corpus Christi, Texas stood in a slow line of hikers at the base of the steel cables that run up the last 400 feet of bare granite. They had been on the road for 11 days, and 4 of those days had been spent at a theme park in Southern California, which is the comparison the family themselves would make in a post from the valley a few days before they started up the trail. Clouds had been building over the high country since late morning, the way they so often do out there in August. And by the middle of that afternoon, the trip the four of them had saved for almost a year would come to an abrupt end. Their names were Reynaldo Cavazos, 54, who went by Ray, and Norma Cavazos, 51, and their 2 children. Their son, Gilbert Cavazos, 22, and their daughter, Perla Cavazos, 19. They lived on the west side of Corpus Christi, a few miles inland from the water. Ray had worked maintenance at a refinery for most of 20 years, and Norma worked in an elementary school front office. Gilbert had finished a 2-year degree that spring and taken a job loading trucks while he worked out what came next, and Perla had a year of community college behind her. The trip had been Ray's idea, and relatives said afterward that the family had been putting money aside for it for the better part of a year, which tells you how much it mattered to them. This was not a casual vacation for people with money to spare. It was the big one, the trip they had agreed to take before the 2 kids got far enough into their own lives that a family trip stopped being possible. The route ran west across the desert down to Southern California for 4 days at a theme park, then north to Yosemite before the long drive home. Neighbors described a family who did things together, the kind who all 4 turned up to a cookout. They were ordinary in the best sense of that word, the sort of family that plans a trip at a kitchen table with a map and a list of what everybody wants, and nothing in that plan points to how this ended. The pictures from that trip are still online, and they are worth sitting with for a minute. There is one of the 4 of them outside a theme park gate in Southern California. Gilbert is holding the phone out at arm's length. Everybody is squinting into the bright light. It is the kind of photo almost every family has in a drawer somewhere. There are a couple of others in between that are just a family on a road trip, a diner booth, a park map held up at a pullout. None of it is remarkable, and that is exactly why it stays with you. 4 days after the theme park, there is another one, taken at a pullout in Yosemite Valley, with Half Dome sitting far off behind them, and Perla is pointing up at it. The caption under that one said they were doing that one next, and that it looked like the ride they had waited in line for the week before. It reads like a joke, the kind anybody would make on a good day. It also shows the comparison they were working from, and it turned out to be an assumption that did not match what Half Dome can do in changing weather. Then there is the last one. It was taken at the trailhead on the final morning, early enough that the sun had not yet reached the floor of the valley. All 4 of them have day packs on. Norma is holding a pair of work gloves in one hand. They look like people at the start of a long day, tired and ready. The sky behind them is already light and gives nothing away, and that is the last picture of the 4 of them together that anybody will ever have. It is worth being clear about what those photos can and cannot tell anyone. They show where the family were and what they carried and what they wrote. They do not show what any of the 4 of them were feeling, and no honest telling of this will pretend otherwise. What they do show is a family who looked like they had done their homework. They had secured one of the required Half Dome permits months before the trip. They had the gloves. They had water and food and a start time written down. That was more preparation than many hikers arrive with. It just was not the part that ended up mattering. They did not skip the homework. They did the homework they had, and nobody handed them the rest of it. Nobody is operating that stretch of rock the way somebody operates a ride, and I need you to hold on to that because it's a large part of why this day unfolded the way it did. To understand what happened, you have to understand what this hike actually is, because almost nothing about the way people talk about it matches the thing. The full trip out of the valley and back runs close to 16 miles, with roughly 4,800 feet of elevation gain, a punishing day even for a fit person who starts early and knows what they are doing. Most of it is a trail. Then, the trail runs out. What is left is a bare shoulder of granite, and then the cables. 2 steel lines strung between posts up the last 400 feet of rock, with boards laid across the stone every 10 feet or so to stand on. The park puts those cables up for a few months each year and takes them down again, and a permit is required for that whole upper stretch, with checks usually happening lower down before the steep shoulder of rock below the cables. Most people who do this regularly carry grippy work gloves, which the park recommends rather than requires. The rock below the cables is its own problem, a steep shoulder of granite with rough steps worn into it, exposed enough that plenty of people find it harder on the nerves than the cables. On a warm afternoon, the whole thing looks less like wilderness than like a queue. People ahead of you and behind you, families among them, a slow shuffle upward while everybody waits their turn. That queue may be the most misleading thing about the place, not because of the crowd, but because of what a crowd makes people assume that somebody has decided this is safe. What there is not is an automatic weather closure, or an attendant at the cables guaranteeing conditions are still fine. Rangers can close an area, halt access, or pull people off the rock in an emergency, and they do. What nobody does is stand at the bottom and decide, hour by hour, whether today is your day to turn around. Steel cables in the rain are a completely different thing from steel cables in the sun, and I want you to keep that in your head while the clouds start stacking up over this family. What makes that rock lethal is not the effort and not the height, it is the weather and what it does to granite and steel. In the Sierra in high summer, hot mornings build into afternoon thunderstorms, and they build fast, often in the space of an hour. The top of Half Dome is a bare, rounded shelf of stone standing higher than everything around it, with two long steel cables running up it, close to the worst place a person can be when a storm arrives. Most people hurt by lightning are not hit directly at all. Electrical current can spread through the ground and across wet surfaces, and there is no telling in advance which path it takes: the rock underfoot, a film of water, or something a person happens to be holding. That is one way people well away from the strike point can be injured, and it is also why the path is so hard to work out afterward. The granite up there is also polished, smooth, and pitched at an angle that gives boots almost nothing to hold, and once water is running across it, the little grip that was there is gone. This is why the park's guidance is worded so plainly, that the cables are the only protection on that face, that they are no protection at all from what is in the sky, and that the moment a storm starts building, the right move is to be somewhere else. There is history behind those warnings. That rock has a long record of afternoon storms catching people out on bare granite with nowhere to go. People have died up there, in falls and in strikes, and it is almost never because the hike was too hard for them. Weather up there changes fast, and nobody announces it, and I think that's the hardest part for people used to a place where a ride simply closes when it rains. They started later than the early departures commonly recommended for that hike. Phone timestamps and photographs placed them at the trailhead shortly after 7, a reasonable hour for almost any other hike in the park and a late one for this. Experienced hikers commonly begin before first light, precisely so they are back down off the bare rock before the afternoon builds. Nothing about the Cavazos family's morning suggests that was the plan. Witness accounts and photograph timestamps indicate they stopped repeatedly along the way, and several hikers later remembered passing a family of 4 who kept stopping for pictures at the bridge and again higher up. By late morning, the sky over the high country had started doing what it does. Several parties described clouds building over the high country well before noon, and 2 of them said they had already decided by then that they would not be going on to the bare rock that afternoon. The family kept going up. They reached the last stretch of granite below the cables in the early afternoon, hours after most experienced hikers would already have been heading down. And by then the light had gone flat, with witnesses later describing the air as still and humid in the period before the storm arrived. Some of what happened next is on video, and it is worth being clear about which parts and how anybody knows. The family posted 2 clips that morning while they still had a signal. The first is from the trailhead, a few seconds of the 4 of them walking off up the trail in the flat early light. There are voices on it and somebody laughs. It is impossible to tell who. The second is from much higher up, later in the morning, and it is the one that stays with people. Gilbert is filming. You can see the line of hikers waiting at the bottom of the cables ahead of them. Roughly 15 to 20 people strung out up the rock, moving a few feet at a time. You can hear wind. You can hear other people talking. Not the family, just the ordinary noise of a crowd. And you can see the sky behind them, which is gray and heavy and clearly building. That clip runs about 11 seconds, and it is the last thing any of them put online. There is nothing in it that looks like a warning. It looks like a queue at a fair. People with day packs, somebody laughing off to the side, a line inching upward. Everything after that came off the phones themselves, which were recovered later. One of them still held readable storage despite the water. There are a few more frames from the cables. There are timestamps showing the family started up that last stretch in the early afternoon, and those timestamps are part of what investigators used to work out the timeline. There is nothing at all after a certain point, and the gap where the rest of that day should be is the whole story. Those clips are still up, and anybody can watch them, which is its own strange thing about a story like this now. The last ordinary minutes of 4 people are sitting there in public, 11 seconds long, and there is nothing in them that would warn anybody. There is one more thing about that clip that is hard to get past. There are other people in it, 15 or 20 of them waiting their turn in the same weather, under the same sky. Most of those people went home. The line the Cavazos family were standing in was not doing anything different from what they were doing, and that is the part that makes this impossible to file away as somebody else's mistake. Someone named Marie Maciotra commented that some people seem to replace reality with social media in their heads, and I think every one of us watching this does that in some small ways, but by the end, you'll see what that can cost. What is known about the last part of the hike up comes from the people coming down, and every one of them said a version of the same thing. Thunder had already been audible. Water had started sheeting across the granite. At least 2 parties turned around at the base of the cables and went back the way they came, which is the correct decision and not an easy one after a long morning of effort. One of those hikers later told investigators that he had stopped on his way down and told the family plainly that the rock was already wet and that he would not be going up in that weather. He said they kept going. That is as far as any honest account of that exchange can go, because he reported what he said and what they did, and nobody can tell you what was said back. Investigators also established from the phone timestamps that the family were on the cables in the early afternoon and estimated the family's positions on the cables using the witness accounts together with those timestamps. One more detail matters. They were not alone and not last. There were people above them and below them on that steel, which means they were responding to the same weather as a dozen strangers who had also decided to keep going. Families do this same hike every week of the season and get home just fine. And that's exactly why the ones who never make it back are so hard for me to talk about. The storm reached the rock while they were on the cables. Hikers below on the granite described rain arriving hard and fast, and water beginning to sheet down the face under the boards. One of the closest surviving hikers investigators interviewed was Nathan Silvera, 33, from Modesto, who was on the cables a few boards below the family with a friend. What Silvera told investigators in interviews conducted after he had been treated is one of the most detailed first-hand accounts that exists of any part of it. He said there was a flash and a crack that came at the same instant, close enough that he said he felt it in his arms and his chest through the steel. He said his hands came off the cable and he went down onto the boards, and that he does not know how long he was down. He said that when he could see again, the 2 people who had been directly above him were no longer on the cable, and that he saw them going down the wet granite beside the line of posts. He could not see the upper part of the cables from where he lay, and he has never claimed to. Other hikers lower on the rock reported the same flash and reported seeing people fall from the cables above them. Nobody still on that face saw everything, and nobody has pretended to. The record is a set of accounts from people who each saw one piece of it, in rain, in seconds, holding onto a steel cable in a storm. Lightning doesn't have to hit a person directly in order to kill them. And I didn't understand that at all until I started reading about what happened on that rock. What followed was slow, in the way emergencies in places like that always are. Investigators later put roughly 18 people on or near the cables at that moment. Better than a dozen got themselves back down the boards and off the exposed rock under their own power, the only safe thing to do with the storm overhead. 3 from other parties could not manage alone and were helped down by whoever was nearest. 2, who had already reached the top, stayed there until the worst passed and came down later with rangers. Somebody in the line had medical training and worked along the rock checking the people who had been knocked down, and that was the only care anybody got for well over an hour. One hiking party carried a satellite messenger and tried to notify emergency services with it, while others started down the trail to report what had happened as soon as they had reception, moving as fast as the wet rock allowed. Rangers began coordinating a response within the hour, and the park search and rescue team was dispatched, but weather delayed any access to the upper cable route because sending people up a wet face under an active storm would only have added names to the list. The recovery ran into the evening and finished the following morning, roped and careful, over ground that punishes any attempt to hurry. Aviation resources were on standby until the weather permitted, and additional medical personnel assisted once the injured reached safer ground. With the hurt from other parties taken for treatment, some with the hearing damage, the temporary numbness and confusion, and the minor electrical burns, a close strike leaves behind. Silvera came off the rock on his own feet with a hand on either side of him and was carried the last part of the way down the shoulder below the cable. cables. Rescues on that face are among the hardest work the park does, and the reports from those operations describe the storm as only part of the problem, because the water that makes the granite deadly makes every rope and every carry slower for the crews as well. By the time it was over, the crews had accounted for everyone on that rock. The 4 members of the family were found in 2 places, 2 on the granite below the line of posts, and 2 near the upper end of the cables, a family from Corpus Christi who had come to see the view. Warnings up there are written the way they're written because of days exactly like this one, and I wish more of us read them as something other than words meant for other people. Now the honest part, because this is where stories like this usually go wrong. Nobody watched all 4 of them at the same time. The one person who was closest and lived, Nathan Silvera, was knocked flat by the current and saw only the 2 who had been right above him. Everything else has been reconstructed, and that word deserves to be said plainly rather than dressed up. Reconstructed means investigators took what could be checked and worked out the shape of what happened, and then stopped. Here is what they had. They had Silvera's account and the accounts of the other hikers who were on the granite and the ones who had turned back earlier that afternoon. They had the 2 clips the family posted that morning and what was still readable on one recovered phone. They had the lightning detection records for that afternoon, which put a cloud-to-ground strike in the vicinity in the same period. They had the places on the rock where the 4 of them were found and the documented injuries in each case. They had the weather logs and the reports from the crews who went up. And that is roughly where it ends. Not all of it survived and not all of it lined up. Some of the phone storage was ruined by the water, some accounts disagreed about the order of things, and the timeline that came out of it is a probable one and was written down as probable. It does not give the order of it with any certainty. It does not give what any of the 4 of them saw or did in the last seconds, and it does not give a single word that passed between a father, a mother, a son, and a daughter on a wet cable in a storm, because none of that was ever recorded, and none of it came back down off that rock. There are things here that will never be known and are not worth guessing at. Which one of them started up that last stretch first? Whether anybody looked at the sky and said something about it. How long any of it took. This account will not invent it. Anyone who tells this story with those parts filled in, with the words and the looks and the last thing somebody said, made all of that up, and doing that to a family is a worse thing than most people stop to think about. What the evidence gives is the plain shape of an afternoon, and that has to be enough. Reynaldo, Norma, Gilbert, and Perla Cavazos all died on Half Dome that afternoon, on the last 400 feet of a hike they had crossed half the country to do. The county sheriff's office, which serves as the county coroner, ruled all 4 deaths accidental. 2 of them were attributed to the injuries of a fall from a great height, and 2 were attributed to lightning-related electrical injuries. Investigators concluded that 2 of them sustained fatal blunt force trauma after falling from the cables during or immediately after the strike, and that the 2 found near the upper end died of electrical injuries consistent with a lightning event. As for how the current reached them, investigators considered ground current, contact with the cable and current spreading across the wet surface as possible mechanisms, and the record does not settle on one. The scene suggested that all of it happened within seconds of a single strike, though the exact order could not be established and the report did not claim it could. There was no failure of equipment, because there was none involved beyond a pair of work gloves and a cable the park had installed. There was no stunt and no horseplay, and nothing that makes this easy to file away as somebody else's mistake. There was a family in a line of other people, most of the way up, in whether everyone coming down had already read correctly, and that nobody in that line could argue with. The report noted that all 4 had been wearing gloves, and that the packs recovered with them held water, food, and rain shells, details investigators write down even when none of it could have changed anything. No one saw the exact moment that any one of them died, and no honest telling of this will ever claim otherwise. What is certain is the ending. By that evening, all 4 of them were gone, and the rest of the trip they had saved a year for never happened. Investigators found no evidence of criminal negligence and no basis for any enforcement action. And that's honestly a really hard thing for me to accept, because it means there's no villain in this story anywhere. The findings recorded 4 accidental deaths in a lightning-related event on exposed granite in an afternoon thunderstorm. Nobody was cited, and no equipment defect or regulatory violation was identified because the family had a valid permit and had broken no rule anyone could point to. Going up in building weather is not illegal. It is only, on the wrong afternoon, fatal. In the season since, the park has kept making the same point it was already making that summer, that the cables offer no protection from a storm, that afternoon thunderstorms in that country build faster than people expect, and that the only real answer is to be off that rock before they arrive. Nathan Silvera was treated and released and has spoken about that afternoon only a handful of times, and by every indication from those close to him, he has found it hard going since. The 2 clips the family posted that morning are still online. No further public posts ever appeared, and the last thing on the account is 11 seconds of a line of hikers and a gray sky. One thing runs through all of it, from the permit they were proud of to the work gloves in Norma's hand at the trailhead, and it is that all of this was avoidable right up until the second it was not. I have thought a long time about how to tell this without making the Cavazos family into a punchline, because the joke in that caption makes it easy and because it would be wrong. What killed that family was not stupidity. It was a reasonable assumption that turns out not to be true. Everything about the way people reach that rock looks managed. You apply for a permit and somebody grants it. You arrive to signs and rangers and a maintained trail. You get to the hard part and there are steel cables already bolted into the stone by the park, boards to stand on, and a line of ordinary families ahead of you shuffling up in the sun. Every one of those is a signal that somebody has looked at this and decided it is fine. That is exactly how a theme park works, and exactly how this does not. Nobody up there is watching the sky for you. There is no system that closes the cables when a storm builds. The permit is a crowd control measure and not a promise. The cables provide handholds on dry rock and do nothing at all for you in a thunderstorm, and the families ahead of you know no more about what is coming than you do. And it is worth saying plainly that most people standing in that line on that day would have read it the same way. The rock does not know that you saved for a year. It offers everybody the same terms, and it does not warn anyone twice. Watching that family in their trailhead photo, I don't see anybody being careless. I see 4 people trusting a place to look after them, which is something I've done plenty of times myself. I do not tell this story to stand over 4 people who cannot answer, because there is nothing worth having in that, and because the warning belongs to anybody who has ever driven a long way to see something and refused to let weather take it away. The cables go up every season and come down again. On busy summer days, the line still forms, and thousands go up every year and come back down with sore legs and good pictures and no idea how narrow the margin was. The storms still build in high summer, on the same schedule nobody publishes, and every season rangers encounter hikers starting up that last stretch of granite with gray stacking up behind them. The signs have not changed and the advice has not changed, because the advice was never the problem. The only thing that changed is that in a house on the west side of Corpus Christi, there is a set of road trip photos that stops in the middle, 4 days of a theme park and a few days of a valley and 1 picture from a dark trailhead, and then nothing. If there is anything to carry down from a day this bad, it is only this. The places that feel the most managed are the ones where we let our guard down the furthest, and no view on this earth has ever been worth staying on bare rock while a storm comes in.